Welcome to Machiavelli in the Ivory Tower, a videocast series on arms control, non-proliferation, and related international security issues. I'm Sarah Bidgood, Director of the Eurasia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Monterey, California.
And I'm Hanna Notte, Senior Research Associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation.
Join us as we discuss cutting-edge research and what it means for real-world decision-makers. Whether it's nuclear doctrine, deterrence dynamics, regional challenges, or the state of international regimes, there's just so much to talk about.
And with our guests, we'll break down how their analysis can help us make sense of a complex security landscape.
In each episode, we'll bring Machiavelli into the Ivory Tower.
Thanks for watching. We're glad you're along for the ride.
Welcome to Machiavelli in the Ivory Tower. We are so thrilled to have as our guest today Rose Gottemoeller, who is the Stephen C. Hazy Lecturer at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. I think everybody probably knows this, but before, Rose served as the Deputy Secretary General of NATO. And then prior to that, she was the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the US Department of State. Rose, Hannah and I are so thrilled to have you with us here today, and thank you very much for making time in your busy schedule.
My pleasure.
So Rose, let me kick us off here. You recently published a piece in the Financial Times where you argued that the West must act now to break what you called Russia's nuclear fever. For those in our audience who maybe haven't yet read your article, can you tell us about some of the concerns that you raise in it and some of the recommendations that you are proposing to address those concerns?
Yes, some really senior and well-known Russian experts are toying with the notion of nuclear apocalypse as a way to get the United States and its NATO allies to sit up and take notice that Russia is really, really concerned about the way that NATO has been helping Ukraine throughout this horrible war. And I think this kind of toying with nuclear apocalypse is extraordinarily irresponsible. But they are taking their cue from Vladimir Putin, who started talking in this way as early as 2018. He was putting these kinds of ideas out there, saying that a world without the Russian Federation is not a world worth having. And this is then linked to the Russian idea that what the West is all about, the political West, NATO, the allies, the United States, that what the West is all about is dismembering Russia, and that they would like to see this war end with Russian annihilation in a political way by its dismemberment. Strategic defeat of Russia in this war does not mean Russian dismemberment, but it does mean that Russia has to get its troops out of Ukraine. It has to atone for the many mortal sins it has committed in the course of this terrible war. And furthermore, it then has to be ready to help pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. So there are some heavy lifts that Russia will have to do, but what the West is talking about and NATO is talking about is not the dismemberment of Russia. So in that context, I said, first of all, let's make that clear, but then let's try to get back to the nuclear table as quickly as possible and begin discussing a follow-on to the New START Treaty and take some other actions to try to bring down the nuclear temperature with Russia. And also we need to start thinking hard about the future of security in Europe in a conventional defense sense, and also need to talk with our allies as well as with Russia about what those future security arrangements could look like.
Rose, let me come in here with a couple of follow-up questions on that really very, very good piece, I thought. This toying with nuclear apocalypse on the Russian side, or the nuclear fever, as you call it, we've really seen this flurry of articles over the last week, in particular, sort of two individuals raising the nuclear specter, and then some very respected scholars responding and actually criticizing that. How do you read that? Is there some genuine debate still, public debate on those issues on the Russian side? Or do you view it as somewhat orchestrated, as some individuals in the West would like to think?
Knowing the people involved, I definitely think that there is a debate in train here, and it's a debate that is, in my mind, a true debate. It might be certainly encouraged by certain actors inside the government, but these are individuals who have long time worked together in Moscow, people like Alexei Arbatov, Fyodor Lukyanov, both of whom are at IMMO, the Institute for World Economy and International Relations, coming down hard on the side of this is crazy to be talking about nuclear annihilation, nuclear apocalypse, and here are the reasons why. And on the other side of the debate, people like Sergei Karaganov and Dmitry Trenin, again, very serious experts in the past, have been well-respected experts in the past, but this toying with nuclear annihilation is, in my mind, really quite irresponsible on their part.
One of the recommendations in your piece, and you just noted it, is that we return to the nuclear, or that we restore nuclear cooperation with the Russian Federation as soon as possible and return to the table. Now, Russia, of course, has suspended participation in the New START earlier this year. I want to ask you how you view the US position on that problem set evolving. We had quite a noteworthy speech by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan a few weeks ago at the Arms Control Association. And I want to quote from that speech. Jake Sullivan emphasized a US willingness to engage Russia on bilateral arms control, quote unquote, without preconditions. And he argued that rather than waiting to resolve all our bilateral differences, the United States is ready to engage Russia now to develop a post-2026 arms control framework. I want to ask you, Rose, do you think that the US position has evolved in the sense that the Biden administration is no longer insisting that Russia first return into full compliance with New START before the two sides can talk about a post-2026 arrangement?
I take Jake Sullivan at his word, and I know those words were very carefully crafted with full interagency participation on the U.S. side. So when he said to engage on the post-2026 nuclear arms control future without preconditions, I take that very, very seriously. I do think there was some heavy debate inside the government on this as to whether or not somehow Russia should return to full implementation of New START before further discussions could happen. But I, for one, was glad to see this notion of no preconditions put out there. I've been a bit disappointed, to be honest with you, because it was an invitation to Moscow to begin to really get some substantive ideas into circulation and begin to wrestle with some of the nuclear agenda items. But so far from Moscow, there's been a kind of, I guess there's a debate in Moscow when it comes down to it. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has responded very stiffly to this proposal from Sullivan. Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, was rather more forward-leaning. Then we had the words of Putin at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, really being tough and even obscene on the notion of further exchanges on nuclear matters, nuclear arms control with the United States. But then again, Peskov coming out on the Kremlin podium and saying, well, what the boss really meant to say was, we are ready for further discussions. So there's clearly a debate going on in Moscow, but I, for one, hope, because the United States has worked hard to make this gesture, I, for one, hope that Moscow will be willing to reciprocate and at least begin to be forward-leaning on the notion of engaging, but also perhaps put some ideas out there about what Moscow would want out of such a process.
Yeah, Rose, this is great. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, but you mentioned the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in your comments just now, and it raises something for me that you and I have had a chance to talk about a number of times recently, which is Russia's planned nuclear deployments to Belarus. So last week at this self-same St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, President Putin said that the first nuclear warheads have been delivered to Belarus. And he said that by the end of the summer, by the end of this year, we will complete this work. Now, I feel like within our sort of community of nuclear analysts, nuclear experts, there seems to be almost two different perspectives about this particular issue. In one camp, you have those who are arguing that these planned deployments are basically inconsequential for NATO's defense and deterrence posture. But then you have others in a different camp who really see this as, Russia giving a warning primarily to Poland in light of the short ranges of the delivery vehicles that would be intended for that nuclear mission in Belarus. I think for those who fall into that latter camp, this is especially worrying against the backdrop of something we've already discussed, which is, the Russian strategic community seemingly being more comfortable with the idea of limited nuclear war, the idea that you could limit and wage a nuclear war that was limited without it sort of escalating in uncontrolled ways. So with all of that as backdrop, I'd love to hear your take on the Belarusian deployment and what its possible implications, for NATO might be from your perspective as an expert who knows that problem set so well.
Well, first of all the remarks coming out of Moscow on this matter and out of the Kremlin itself are rather confusing, to be honest. Even at St. Petersburg, and you quoted it yourself, Sarah, a moment ago, Putin said by the end of the summer, by the end of the year, in the single sentence. And I was wondering if he was talking about the US fiscal year, which does end at the end of the summer, at the end of September. So, but of course, he's not talking about the US fiscal year, but it was just to say that this is a confusing message coming from the big man himself about what exactly is going on. And I see that interspersed throughout the community, the official community in Russia and in Belarus, what exactly is going on. Lukashenko certainly doesn't help either with the various remarks that he has made. As far as I understand, there is, and this is from open media reporting, there's still precious little evidence that there has actually been a movement of warheads into Belarus. And I know the open source intelligence community is watching this very, very closely. So I think we'll continue to follow it very closely. But the messages are mixed out of Moscow in terms of when and how the deployment will happen, but they are not mixed regarding the deployment. I have to be quite honest with you. I fall into the camp of those who don't see a big strategic shift for NATO. The big strategic shift in my mind, and it was the reason the United States in the end of the day withdrew from the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, is the ongoing deployment of the 9M729, an intermediate range nuclear armed missile that NATO concluded, and quite rightly, could hit any NATO capital within a matter of minutes. And so that to me was the big strategic shift and correctly led to the withdrawal from the INF Treaty of the United States. Greatly to my regret, I wish that the Russians had responded to our efforts to fix this problem. Only later did Putin notice that, hey, this is bad if suddenly the United States starts deploying intermediate missiles that could come to Moscow within a very short period of time. NATO has only talked about conventional missiles in that range, but nevertheless, a new threat to Russia. So all of a sudden now, Putin then a couple of years ago proposed a moratorium on such deployments in Europe. So we'll see if we do get back to the table with the Russians. I would argue that that's one of the earliest areas that we have to work on, placing new constraints on intermediate range nuclear armed missiles, both in Europe and in Asia as well, I would argue.
That's really interesting, Rose. I mean, so we're sort of talking about one way of looking at the potential deployments to Belarus. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about different implications of this issue, which you're also very familiar with. It seems to me that this issue is probably going to feature very heavily in the deliberations at the NPT PrepCom meeting, which is scheduled to convene not long from now in early August in Vienna. I'm wondering, from your perspective as somebody who has, led the delegation of the United States to NPT review conference meetings, et cetera, what do you think that the Western states, broadly speaking, should do to address the Belarus issue at the PrepCom? I mean, we hear Russia strongly making the case that it's just basically imitating what the United States has already done for decades. They point in this regard to the practice of NATO nuclear sharing. Can you help us understand, first of all, why are these situations different? And then second of all, from your perspective, would it be helpful if the Western states were a bit more forthcoming in discussing NATO nuclear sharing, maybe even discussing, things like AUKUS? And would that help to address some of these allegations of, maybe double standards or hypocrisy that we hear some states leveling against the West? What's your take on that?
Yes, indeed. The Russians have been very good, and they are very good at delivering that message of hypocrisy and differing standards. It's a long-standing tool they use to try to divide the Western allies and also to divide other states from the particular positions of the United States and, again, its allies around the world. So it's a very clever and well-worn tactic of the Russian Federation, and in this case, they've done a very good job. I'd like to address the history of NATO nuclear sharing just for a minute to really differentiate with what Putin is doing. Putin is very much on the line of If the United States gets to do it, I get to do it too. And I've heard from Russian experts time and time again that anything he perceives the US is doing, then he gets to do too, period. And so that is, I think, the spirit in which this decision was taken. And it was not on the Russian side very much a decision formed by a nuclear mission space or a nuclear strategic objective. I think it was very much Me Tooism on the part of Putin. But that said, I think it makes sense to look back at the origins of nuclear sharing, which were back during the negotiation of the NPT in the 1960s, when the Soviet Union very much agreed with the notion of NATO nuclear sharing, that is, that the United States would extend nuclear deterrent capability to the NATO allies and work with them to share those capabilities, but would sustain and maintain the control and the authority to launch over those systems, with the idea that the USSR was hell-bent at that time on shutting down other NATO nuclear programs, especially Germany's nuclear program, but other programs in Italy and elsewhere. It was weird to think about. It is weird to think about now, but in those days, there were programs across Europe in places as diverse as Switzerland and Sweden to develop nuclear weapons. And so Russia, the USSR at that time, was very, very keen. And so they fully approved the NATO nuclear sharing mission at that time as a way to prevent broader proliferation of nuclear weapons programs among NATO nuclear allies. So what does Putin have as his strategic objective here by deploying in Belarus? Is it to prevent somehow other former Soviet republics from developing their nuclear programs, or Belarus itself from developing a nuclear program? I don't think that there is a big strategic objective here, aside from, as I put it, this Me Tooism. It's not a non-proliferation move in the way that US nuclear sharing with its NATO allies is profoundly a nuclear non-proliferation move.
That's really useful, Rose. I do want to come back to the NPT, the PrepCom, which Sarah just mentioned. And for those of our listeners who are not familiar, this is the preparatory committee that is meeting in Vienna under the auspices of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, after a conference last summer that failed to agree on a consensus final document. And it's sort of the premier multilateral forum for nuclear diplomacy. So Rose, I want to ask you, with everything that's going on in geopolitics at the moment, this heightened acrimony between Russia and the West, but also tensions between the United States and China, what is even possible today in multilateral nuclear diplomacy? I mean, should states go there really with the maxim of, quote unquote, doing no harm, not rocking the boat too much to just preserve what we have? Or do you think that actual progress in some areas is possible at this time?
Well, I do take note that on the eve of the war in Ukraine in January of 2022, the P5 nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that is the United States, Russia, China, the UK, and France, they did agree a paper. In it is included the Gorbachev Reagan statement that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, but also they agreed to undertake actions, measures, even agreements together in the context of the NPT review process, including the preparatory committee meetings and then the review meeting that will go on in a couple of years' time. So I know that the United States has been chairing this so-called P5 process since that time and has been really very intent on developing cooperation in the area of lowering nuclear risks. And I understand that they actually had a rather productive meeting in Cairo just last week that is in the middle of June, and that they were able to have some very, I would say, I'm not going to say very productive, I'll just say productive meetings and discussions across a number of substantive areas. Now, whether they produce any actual measures, actions, agreements, I can't say at this point, but at least the intention of the United States is to try to have some pragmatic outcomes to be able to show the preparatory committee meeting that the P5 process is producing results. And I actually see it as a foundational effort for future nuclear arms control and reduction measures that would involve the P5 states overall, not only in the bilateral US-Russia sense, but also other P5 countries. And of course, the concern is front and center about China as again, Jake Sullivan put it during his speech, it's interesting that among the nuclear weapon states, UK and France self-limit. They keep their arsenals very small and take unilateral measures to continue to constrain those arsenals. The United States and Russia are limited, still limited by the New START treaty, both sides abiding by the limits, even though Russia is refusing to implement the verification regime. But in the end of the day, it's only China among the P5 that has not embraced any limits on its nuclear developments. And this is very concerning at a time when China is modernizing. So I do hope that within the realm of the P5, at least some mutual understanding can be developed about the necessity, first of all, of predictability among the P5, that there should be good communications. There should be willingness to talk about modernization plans and what their objectives are. And also then eventually a willingness to talk about control and I will say in the first instance, probably risk reduction measures, but also controls in future.
Rose, this is a perfect segue to a question that I want to ask you actually about risk reduction. Even prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I feel like we heard from many different sectors of the sort of nuclear expert community that A, risk reduction is important, and B, risk reduction is maybe something that could be a more possible area, more fruitful area for cooperation at a time when, traditional arms control agreements, legally binding agreements, arms reduction agreements are either on the rocks or seem totally out of reach. So I guess first and foremost, I'm wondering, in the context of today, what you think the most likely pathways to nuclear use are, because presumably that should kind of dictate our focal areas for nuclear risk reduction. And then related to that, in terms of operationalization, like how do we engage in bilateral risk reduction efforts with a country that appears to embrace or even try to exploit nuclear risk as a deliberate strategy to achieve political objectives? And I guess I would just tack on here, based on sort of the comments you made a moment ago about the P5 process, like, is there any utility in kind of the gift basket approach that was used at the nuclear security summits, where you have states bringing unilateral risk reduction measures to the table, maybe not risk reduction measures that are necessarily cooperative, but things that they believe in their own doctrine or strategy might help to lower the nuclear temperature? I'm curious about all of that, how you see that landscape.
I think we go for anything we can at this moment. And if it's unilateral risk reduction measures that are offered up, I would say that there has to be some reciprocity there. It can't be the United States making all the unilateral gestures and none of the rest of the P5 doing anything. But if there's an opportunity to call forth parallel unilateral measures, certainly we should try to do that. If there's an opportunity for some multilateral risk reduction measures, and I particularly think that in the area of declaratory policy, there may be some more things that can be done. We already had a repeat, even as I said, on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we had a repeat of the Reagan-Gorbachev statement. Perhaps there are some other measures that can be taken. Quite specifically, I think the bilateral launch notification, ballistic missile launch notification agreement that the United States and Russia continue to abide by, that's a long-standing agreement between the two parties, and I don't see any reason why the P5 notion, or the notion of a P5 launch notification agreement regarding ballistic missile launches, wouldn't be a sound risk reduction measure for all concerned. So again, there are complexities there. The United States and Russia have well-established lines of communication through our nuclear risk reduction centers. There's a routine there, there are protocols, there are notification formats. It's all very easy to do in a routine manner. So yeah, there'd have to be some additional work to set up those kinds of communication links, but that's the ideal, to my mind, to have in the multilateral world, have that kind of more substantive risk reduction activity going on. But finally, there may be some opportunities on the bilateral front as well with China. Given, well, we've had a bit of a hiccup in the reactions to President Biden's comments in the last couple of days regarding President Xi, but I'm hopeful nevertheless that there's a certain momentum in trying to establish some bilateral tracks with China now that could lead to more, again, communication on a regularized, routinized basis, the establishment of some proto risk reduction center for communications purposes, I think would be a great step. Again, this is nothing that's coming out of the government. This is what's coming out of my mouth. But I think there are opportunities that which we should be looking for across the board. As far as the Russian Federation is concerned, there's no question. I began by saying how concerned I am by this loose talk about nuclear Armageddon. It's ridiculous and irresponsible in every way. But I do believe that there are a number of still very responsible experts, and we mentioned some of them early in our discussion in Russia, and that we should be looking for ways to talk with them and perhaps through them to their government about risk reduction measures that we can take even today, even in the midst of this apocalyptic language.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Rose. I do want to switch gears again slightly. Normally, Sarah and I talk about nuclear issues on this videocast, but you are the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and we do have an important NATO summit coming up in Vilnius rather soon. So we have to ask you about this. The expectation for the summit, of course, is that it will discuss modalities for bringing Ukraine closer to the alliance. But since Ukraine is unlikely going to be offered a clear pathway towards membership at this time, there's an expectation that the focus here will really be on a multi-year package with substantial funding for Ukraine's defense. And then there's also talk about the establishment of a NATO-Ukraine Council in which Ukraine and allies would consult and decide on security issues on a quote-unquote equal basis. And we're really curious in your take here. I mean, are these measures that are envisioned for the summit and that might likely be decided, are they enough? Do you think they'll suffice to make Russia realize that really NATO is committed to supporting Ukraine for real and for good?
Well, first of all, I think Russia must be convinced at this point, given the amount of assistance that the NATO allies have rendered to Ukraine. It's been extraordinary. And again, we've seen just in the last couple of days a commitment not only to assist in continuing to supply weapons and military equipment, but now in London in recent days, the commitment to put funds into reconstruction of Ukraine, including Ukrainian industry going forward, potentially including the defense industries. And Ukraine certainly has been, I think, a harbinger of what is to come in terms of future warfare with the use of drones, and in many cases homemade drones or off-the-shelf drones that have been upgraded to provide additional capability to the Ukrainian military. So I think there's a lot that we can learn, we as NATO can learn from the experience of the Ukrainians in this war. And certainly I think that it should be a two-way street and more, I would say, kind of an equal relationship in NATO and Ukrainian interactions going forward. But that's only by way of introducing what I wanted to say about this. And that is, first of all, there's a delicious element to the NATO-Ukraine Council, and people haven't been discussing it. But at the time, the NATO-Russia Council was formatted back in 2002. It was very much meant to be this equal decision-making body where Russia and the NATO allies would sit together with some equality around the table. I think one of Russia's resentments in the end of the day was that it didn't work out that way, at least as they perceived it, that it was, the NATO allies versus Russia instead of all being in one decision-making body. But for a number of years, it did work in terms of pragmatic implementation of project work and that type of thing. But now, and the NATO Ukraine Commission was meant to be a lesser thing, not quite so cooperative, not quite, an equal partnership. And now suddenly we have the NATO-Ukraine Council. So Russia, having been pushed aside because of their terrible behavior and their aggression against Ukraine, NATO-Russia Council still exists on paper, but it's not meeting. And that was the Russians' choice, quite honestly, to begin with. But now we've got the NATO-Ukraine Council placing Ukraine on an equal footing with Moscow. Some in Moscow are seething about this, I'm quite sure, and I think it's very, very interesting, although others in Moscow completely discard NATO, so they don't even want to think about that past with the NATO-Russia Council and the good work NATO and Russia were able to do together for over a decade from 2002 until about 2013-14 and the invasion of Crimea. So that said, I do applaud those steps that NATO is taking to raise the profile of Ukraine and to make them more of an equal partner. I think it will pay off, again, because of the experience that Ukraine has had in this war and what Ukraine can help NATO to learn in terms of the way future warfare will be conducted. And so that equality of relationship is really going to be important. But furthermore, another thing that's being discussed is that Ukraine can jump straight to an agenda of measures to prepare for NATO membership and not have to go through the membership action plan. Again, this equates them essentially with Sweden and Finland. Sweden not yet in the alliance, Finland in the alliance. But when the Russians invaded Ukraine, immediately Sweden and Finland applied for NATO membership, setting aside over 200 years of neutrality on their part. But they, at that point, were given the green light to approach NATO membership without having to go through a membership action plan. So that also equates then Ukraine with Sweden and Finland in terms of their fast tracking. And I think that that is a good message as well. But the last thing I'll say here is that, as I hear it, no one wants to admit Ukraine into NATO in the midst of this war. I know President Zelensky was very disappointed. I heard him say on radio yesterday, you know, I've told Stoltenberg again and again, the Secretary General of NATO, that we're ready for NATO membership, and he's not opening the door. Well, it's not up to Secretary General Stoltenberg alone. It's the decision of all NATO allies to allow a new member to enter. And for many of the allies, as long as this war is raging, they're not ready to be admitting Ukraine to the alliance.
Rose, this has been such an interesting and wide-ranging conversation, as always, when we speak with you. I want to ask one final question that kind of zooms out a little bit and perhaps takes a different look at things here. One thing we always ask our guests on the show is about basically bridging the gap between academic communities and policymaking communities. You, I think, are the ideal person to ask this question to, because over the course of your very illustrious career, you've been in US government, you've been in the think tank world where you began, you've been at NATO, as you were just discussing, and now here you are at an Institute of Higher Education in the United States. I'm wondering if you can close us out by sharing some wisdom about what these different communities can learn from one another, and maybe how they can more effectively or better or more regularly kind of share ideas across them that will ultimately help to make all of us safer.
It's a great question, Sarah, and I applaud you for asking it. I actually think that the United States of America has a kind of golden system for interaction between the think tank, academic world, and the US government, in that we have this so-called open door system. And indeed, that's how my career has gone. I haven't been a full-time government employee ever. I was always a political appointee. I worked for President Clinton in the 90s and for President Obama from 2009 until 2016. So in that way, I've been able to come and go from government through what we call the revolving door. And it's the way that we constantly refresh our policy ideas by bringing new people into government when new administrations arrive on the scene. And then once, you know, that president leaves and the next administration comes in, then those people who were appointed go back to the think tank world or back to academia. In my case, also, then I went to NATO, to an international organization for 3 years as well. I hear constantly when I'm talking to other experts around the world, not only in Europe or in Asia, but around the world, that they admire our system because it does allow for this refreshment of policy ideas constantly to occur, but it also allows for people to have quite varied careers working both in government and in the think tank world. Oftentimes I hear people in a Ministry of Foreign Affairs in some corner of the globe say, well, I came into the ministry after university and I'm basically stuck here for my whole career. I can't move anywhere else. And so I do think that our system is much admired for that revolving door nature to it. And I see it as being very beneficial to our policy, the vitality of our policy. Sometimes administrations come in and I don't agree with their policy one bit, but it does shake things up and it forces people to think, and it forces sometimes some pretty rough fights. But nevertheless, it means that we're not stale in the way our initiatives are going forward. But I also wanted to state that at this current moment, because communications are so poor, and I know, of course, the situation with Moscow better than anything, but also with Beijing at this moment, these are two of the most important, I would say, interlocutors on nuclear matters. We're concerned about keeping the Russians under limits because they are on a parity basis with us. We're concerned about beginning to talk to the Chinese about controlling their nuclear weapons because they're on a modernization course that we cannot foresee the end of. So I think that this is a golden moment for the so-called Track 2 process. And I can see that there's a lot of interest in what we are able to accomplish, the academic community, the think tank community, because communications lines between governments are down now, or they're muffled, but we are able to help pass along some messages, to receive some messages, to keep a kind of discourse going with both Moscow and Beijing. And I think that this is really, really important. Track 2 is not always so important, and especially when there's lots of diplomacy going on and lots of communication going on, government to government, it's not so important. But it is, in my view, a kind of golden moment right now where the think tank community and the academic community can make a big contribution, and are making a big contribution, in my view.
Rose, I'm very glad we're ending this conversation today on an optimistic note about what Track 2 can achieve in the current geopolitical environment. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the nuclear fever in Russia at the moment to the upcoming summit in Vilnius and multilateral diplomacy in Vienna at the NPT PrepCom. And I really think we couldn't have had someone more knowledgeable or experienced to cover these issues with us today. So I really want to thank you for taking the time to be on the show with us today.
Well, thank you both so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Absolutely great questions, and thank you again.